The CDC has reported that over 30 million Americans have diabetes, and 1 in 4 are undiagnosed. With such an epidemic, I'd imagine most of you watching this video most likely know someone personally who lives with diabetes. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I've lived with type 1 diabetes for over 20 years now, and I hope to give you a bit of an explanation about the differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. In general, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, while type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disease. In order to better understand what diabetes is, we have to talk about what happens during digestion in a normal, healthy person. So, if you eat a piece of food, that food will travel from your esophagus to your stomach and eventually into your small intestines, where the glucose in that food will be absorbed. And that glucose will enter the bloodstream, which signals the pancreas to release a hormone called insulin. Insulin is basically a dinner bell for the body. It tells all the cells of your body that there's glucose available for energy and to eat up. So this is where diabetics have a problem. In type 1 diabetes, the immune system actually attacks the cells that produce insulin. So a type 1 diabetic can no longer produce any insulin at all. Without insulin, cells will effectively starve and large amounts of glucose are left inside the bloodstream. In order to flush this excess glucose out, the body will try to literally siphon it out of you through any way it can, through sweating, through urination, through any process, and this causes a lot of damage to your organs and it shrivels you up like a skeleton. This is why the word diabetes comes from the Greek, meaning to siphon. Type 1 diabetics are completely dependent on synthetic insulin to survive. No amount of diet or exercise will help treat type 1 diabetes, although it's good for everyone. So type 1 diabetes is also called juvenile diabetes, but this is a bit of a misconception. People often think that type 1 diabetes is something you're born with, and that's also not true. Type 1 diabetes is often diagnosed between the ages of 2 and 14. I personally was diagnosed when I was 5, but people can actually be diagnosed with type 1 all the way up into their late 30s and 40s. So this is also why a lot of people who have been diagnosed as type 2, which happens later in life, they were misdiagnosed and they're actually type 1. So what is type 2 diabetes? Type 2 diabetes, or otherwise known as late onset diabetes, is primarily diagnosed after childhood and is when the body no longer responds adequately to insulin, even though there's plenty of insulin available. According to the National Institute of Health, over 84 million people in the US have the beginning stages of type 2 diabetes. This is also known as prediabetes. Prediabetes is when your average blood glucose levels start to rise higher than normal, but not enough to have major therapy involved. The reason average blood glucose levels start to rise is because the body's ability to respond to insulin lowers. This is called insulin resistance. And insulin resistance starts when the body creates too much insulin at first. So this can happen when you eat something that's high in carbohydrates, high in sugar content. So when the body dumps a lot of insulin into the blood, the body will actually respond a little less to it. So because of this lowered response, the pancreas will try to compensate for that by making more insulin, which just causes more insulin resistance. So this cycle continues more and more and more, and eventually the body will be producing too much insulin, and actually some of the cells in the pancreas will burn out and die. It is at this point that glucose levels can no longer be properly regulated, and almost you're becoming type 1 diabetic, but you still have a lot of insulin being made. So it is at this point type 2 diabetes is diagnosed, and treatment starts by taking an oral medication that will actually increase the body's sensitivity to insulin at first. But if habits are left unchecked, then this resistance will continue more and more and more, and the cells in your pancreas will die, and you will need synthetic insulin just like a type 1 diabetic. However, your body will be really resistant to insulin to get to that point. So that synthetic insulin, adding that to the mix, will most likely make things even worse. So the only way to really begin reversing that process is by lowering the amount of insulin the body uses. Even though a type 2 diabetic might lose all of their insulin producing cells, they can actually create more, and some of it can possibly be reversed early on. Type 1 diabetics can also experience insulin resistance, and they can effectively have type 1 and type 2 diabetes, um, called, well, double diabetes. Kind of a funny name. So overall, I hope that I've made a clear difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, that type 1 is an autoimmune disease and type 2 is a metabolic disease. If you're curious about whether or not you may be at risk for diabetes, you can always buy a cheap glucose monitor or A1C testing kit online, but you should really consult your doctor first before making any kind of medical decision. So thank you for watching and have a great day.